hat says. Not finals, not Eastern Conference, not nice try, or see you next year. Champions. Let's go. Talk.
That's who did I steal from? Price tags on making the world feel something. They don't have enough to satisfy a real one.
Logical Raptors Fanatic.
Shoot trying to miss. Like every shot,
Logical Raptors Fanatic.
try to make it, so that was gonna surprise.
Logical Raptors Fanatic.
Love the game of basketball. I mean, it's just more questions you have to ask me in order for me to tell you about.
Logical Raptors Fanatic.
I just can't give you a whole spiel. I don't even know where you're sitting at. Like.
Salute, real ones. Project Truth always. Mike G back here with Logical Raptors Fanatic, and we're continuing our CBA changes and our start of the season series for 2023-2024. So this one I wanted to go over the extension rules and some of the new contract stuff, but I realized there was a new exception that I needed to go over first. And it involves the draft, so we'll do the draft changes and this new exception and some of the more salary cap changes in this new CBA. So let's get started. So here we'll start off with the draft changes, and it's some interesting mechanisms now, and it's really interesting how they're deciding to disclose different parts of information, so we'll get into it. Here are the details on how the new CBA will affect the NBA draft. Point 1. A player who is invited to the draft combine and declines to attend without an excused absence will be ineligible to be drafted. He would become eligible the following year by attending the combine. There will be exceptions made for a player whose CBA season is ongoing, who's injured, or who is dealing with a family matter such as a tragedy or the birth of a child. So that's in part because they want to make sure teams have enough information when drafting guys. Like the one and done rule is so sure, and then they have a chance to not even be tested at the combine and still get drafted high and whatnot. And it's like, I think players are using it to circumvent certain procedures that are meant to check whether they'll be a long-term player or not. And I think a lot of busts get developed in this way because they're not actually like the players that you should be drafting at that spot based on certain information. And if that information isn't released, then teams will pick that guy assuming that he will become whoever, right? So I think just the more information you can get around drafting prospects is key when you're investing so much money and these picks are worth so much. We're going to talk about how they're trying to increase the value of second round picks in the next slide, but let's continue on with point 2. Players who attend the draft combine will be required to undergo physical exams, share medical history, participate in strength, agility, and performance testing, take part in shooting drills, receive anthropometric measurements, and conduct interviews with teams and the media. Point 3. Medical results from the combine will be distributed to select teams based on where the player is projected to be drafted. The NBA and the NBPA, so the Players Association, intended to agree on methodology to rank the top 10 prospects in a draft class. Only teams drafting in the top 10 would get access to the medical info of the projected number 1 pick. Teams in the top 15 would receive medical info for the players in the 2 to 6 range, while teams in the top 25 would get access to the info of players in the 7 to 10 range. So they're kind of waiting, like if you have a higher selection, you get access to the more like sensitive information, like medical history, stuff that's like pertinent. Like the players are giving up their right to medical secrecy in this kind of whole process, but on that same point, they want the information to be controlled properly. So not every team knows if like they have a bad knee or something like that. Like something whatever, you know what I mean? Something whatever is each prospect's injury history is completely different, but ultimately in the end of the day, you do want to protect your stars and not have like targets on their head because every team in the league knows exactly where to hit them based on certain medical information or whatever, you know what I mean? So protecting this sort of the higher pick and most likely the more successful picks medical history will actually help them in the long run, and maybe this information gets out either way some of the time and stuff, but it's about the structure and the players really wanting control over their medical results and stuff. Like Kawhi was really mad when Adam Silver kind of announced that he had degenerative knees and whatnot, so there is a little bit of backlash from the players wanting their secrecy when it comes to medical stuff, which is fair because everyone has that right. But also, as a player entering a draft where teams have to pick based on physical attributes, and there's a physical side, so health is part of it, of a sport, right? So it gets murky, but I think they want to come to a better structure where everyone's happy. So let's continue on. Point 4. Prospects who forego college in favor of signing professional contracts with programs like the G League Ignite, Overtime Elite, or the NBL Next Stars will no longer automatically become draft eligible during the calendar year when they turn 19. Those players now won't become draft eligible until they enter in on their own accord or until the calendar year when they turn 22. So interesting. So they want to give room for prospects that think they want more overseas training before drafted to kind of get their NBA career started off properly and really well. And it's sort of money implications and whatnot. Maybe a year overseas upgrades your first entry contract a lot more than getting a low entry contract and trying to build up that way. So I think there are favorable money variances in that, but also like G League, like Ignite and stuff, they would like some guys maybe to get 2 years of reps or whatnot. Like we don't want to limit it to just one and done of pros and then you have to go NBA. So like there is some room. They want allow prospects to develop over time better, and now they're putting a hard mark of 22 instead of the 19 when a pro becomes eligible in another league. So interesting how they're kind of switching things around, like realizing it's a more global game. Not every like player is gonna come from the college side of ball, right? There are great prospects and a lot of great players that are coming out from all parts of the world, right? That have been playing professional for a little bit before they've even come, like Luka Doncic playing quite a bit in his country, right? So let's continue on. Last point here. The one and done rule prohibiting prospects from entering the NBA draft directly out of high school will not be changed, despite speculation to the contrary. So yeah, they're not gonna unleash the horses again. They want to make sure that you get a seasoned enough prospect where you can make a logical judgment on their projection. And so more of these draft picks will convey over time and actually become the players that are supposedly like imagined when all this information is put together, right? So let's continue on, and there's some interesting changes with some of the cap stuff, but I just wanted to go over the draft stuff first, and we'll continue on. So now on to salary cap changes. The following changes will apply to the salary cap. So point 1, the cap will increase by no more than 10% per league year in order to avoid a repeat of the 32% spike in 2016. So obviously, that's the logic behind why I structured the contracts backloaded, because the cap, there wasn't a huge money injection, but they were sparsing it out over years. So this year is 10 million, next year is like 7 or 8, and then it continues on 7 or 8 again, and trying to like, that's how the money's spread out versus this big lump sum of 32%, where a team that was in the cap now had access to another max level contract, aka Kevin Durant, and was able to build that Golden State thing where it got really crazy, right? So and some of the contracts that were signed in that spike were overvalued. Like Batum got like a crazy amount, right? And then Biyombo got his crazy amount in 2016, right? So they don't want any of that kind of stuff anymore. So what the logical sense is to backload it so you can kind of give them an appropriate spike over the next 3 or 4 years, whatever the contract length is, and have it appropriately gauge up with the salary, and not have you in the first apron or second apron and whatnot. And I showed how we didn't have to have luxury tax, even though we could keep everyone, but that's not even a point anymore. So let's continue on with the next point here. The value of the mid-level exception will receive a 7.5% bump, and the room exception will be increased by 30%. Those bumps, in addition to the exception's usual increase, which is tied to the salary cap, the taxpayer's mid-level exception will be reduced to $5 million in 2023-2024, and will increase at the same rate as the cap after that. So what they're saying there is, instead of $6 million for the people in the first apron, now they got $5 million. And people, like, you know what I mean? Like, so 5, if you spend over 5, you start to get into like hard cap territory if you use both those exceptions. So what they're doing is they're trying to make the mid-level exception, the taxpayer portion, smaller, and the non-taxpayer portion bigger, right? So it's more of an even, now it's sliced in the middle instead of a weird like 6 million and then 4 million extra, right? It was weird like that, but now they're trying to like censor, like set everything up to be working in tandem with the salary cap. So each year the salary cap goes up, and based on that number, the mid-level exception, the biannual exception, and there's a new exception coming, I'm going to talk about it, but those exceptions increase based on the salary cap. Everything's tied to the salary cap number. So when it goes official, a lot of these different numbers down the line become official then. And that's how a lot of these things are gauged and scale up properly, so they don't have to change the terminology, and that's why they use percentages. So let's continue on. The room exception will allow for contracts that cover up to 3 seasons, while the taxpayer mid-level exception will only allow for contracts to cover up to 2 seasons. So yeah, like there's a new like thing they're working on, and they want to give access to be able to sign support players, but they don't want that kind of stars taking like small deals and whatnot. So like they're playing around with things a bit here, trying to open up the options for people to sign people, but not when they're like in the second apron and whatnot and all that kind of stuff. So let's continue on. The luxury tax brackets, previously at 5 million intervals above the tax line, will now increase at the same rate of the salary cap. So a certain percentage will increase the intervals. It won't it won't be like there's 10 million added to the cap. It won't be 10 million is added to the intervals. No, it doesn't work like that. It's like a smaller percentage base, and that's how these all are tied, if the terminology isn't clear enough from what I'm reading. So let's Yeah, they're just continuing with the limiting luxury tax teams and whatnot. But let's get on to this new cap exception. So a new cap exception will be introduced for second round picks so that teams no longer need to use cap room or their mid-level exception to give those players salaries worth more than the rookie minimum or deals longer than 2 years. The exception will allow teams to offer contracts that cover up to 4 seasons with a starting salary worth up to 0.1, the equivalent of the vets minimum for second-year players for any 3-year contract, and the equivalent of the vets minimum for a third-year player for any 4-year contract. So we looked at that before, and we have kind of an understanding because we signed Kolokolo last year on our mid-level exception. So the NBA saw that and they're like, no. Players need, like, if they have a second round draft pick, they should have something there to be able to sign them. And there was an issue going on where second round picks were saying don't draft me because they could get better deals undrafted. And that's an issue. That's a fundamental logic issue. If players don't want to be drafted, that starts to break the draft over time and certain things pop up. So they're trying to mediate that whole, like, don't draft me because I want to go undrafted and pick my spot and get a better deal, right? So they're allowing options with the second round picks. And this new cap exception is really interesting because it's based on we saw the vet minimums for a player with no years of experience, and then 1 year of experience, and then 2 years of experience. And we were talking about it in regards to Wieskamp and what he was going to get next year, and Doughton's number, and all those numbers, and Band's number, but now he's gone now. But so all those numbers are dictated by a chart, and those numbers increase based on a certain percentage of the salary cap again. So only those numbers go official when the salary cap goes official. And all these numbers are scaled in different ways. So what they're saying is you can give the equivalent to a second year player. So like he has 1 year of NBA experience for any 3-year contract. So you can give a guy that has no experience more money based off this rule right here if you drafted him with a second round pick. So now it adds a wrinkle into it where second picks can maybe get more money, and that's where you want to kind of get players back wanting to be drafted in the second round, because the draft picks become worthless if players don't want to be drafted in the second round, right? So like they're trying to add more value to the picks because they don't want these like 100 pick deals where like picks are like valued like water. That's not how it's supposed to work, right? They want to make the currency of picks more valuable, so they're injecting a new exception that has to be tied to your second round picks, and you're able to get an exception to get them on the team instead of using your MLE or just being able to offer them the rookie minimum, where undrafted you could maybe offer more, you know what I mean? So let's continue on. Players signed using the second round exception won't count against the cap until July 31st. Interesting. Allowing those players to participate in summer activities without compromising cap room. Very nice. So the way we waited with Koloko last year, and people maybe thought it was unreasonable to wait, but this was the reason. We wanted to finish Summer League, figure out who was staying, who was leaving before we locked in a guy that was for sure staying and where his number was coming from, and we had to grab from the MLE. So they want the second round guys to be signed up earlier, and it's still not like you don't have to start going into the free agency stuff just yet. You could sign them up and hold right there and renegotiate or do whatever later on if you need to, right? for trade purposes or whatever the case. We heard that part in the changes before. So let's continue on. Teams below the minimum salary floor of 90% of the cap on the first day of the regular season will not receive an end of season tax distribution for the league's tax paying teams. So this is where everyone was saying, well, the logic of the Rockets spending a lot of money this offseason. But it's also in part, yes, because of this, but also in part that they wanted a solid leader for the rebuild, and they felt that Fred VanVleet and Ime Udoka could really handle that young core. They don't want a Memphis thing happening in the Rockets scenario, so they overpaid Fred VanVleet to get him to leave, because if the number was anywhere close to like 30 or 35 in that range, he would have chose us even if it was a couple million less. So they had to kind of overpay, but they had to spend that money. But let's continue on. So teams will become hard capped at the first tax apron if they take back more than 110% of the salary they send out in a trade. So interesting. So if that trade puts them into the first tax apron with the method of taking back more than 110% of a salary than they send out in a trade, that actually hard caps them. So their last trade can't be for getting more salary. So like you can't like stand at the edge of the apron and then do a big trade and put you superly into the second apron now, but you don't care because you made the trade when you had like little room to do so. So they're kind of stopping that kind of weird gap where it's like the rules apply if you're trading in that same frame, but it's like a symptom where you get hard capped, where it makes it so that's the last trade you're gonna make because you can't go any further. So like it's really interesting how they're trying to limit the teams to build in those tax aprons, because they don't want that. They don't want teams paying like $4 million in freaking like salary and taxes to the league, and then some teams tanking because that money's juicy and big. So you don't want to be a taxpayer when you're getting that return profit back from GSW, Clippers, Lakers, everyone, Suns, everyone in the tax is paying money to the teams not in the tax. And that's why the Rockets spent their money, because they're like, oh, we're going to miss out on the bread train. And they've increased the bread train, as you've seen in the last bit there, where they said intervals of 5 million above the tax line, and now they increase at the same rate as the salary cap. So there's going to be a lot of money going back. So that's it's going to be interesting. They're trying to balance things out, right? So they're giving the teams that don't have as much money more fuel to compete and be competitive, but they don't want teams like going crazy because they can and then just out talenting the whole league based on money. And it's not a game anymore when you can just play money. Math skitball is what it's called, where you just play math with basketball and then you don't do the eye test and look at players for real. So there is an element of numbers and doing that stuff, but you also have to like look at players, and these are human players that interact in chemistry. So there's a lot that goes into this, not just the numbers and what if things fit. So like there's a lot of different things with the new salary cap and trades that I want to go over clearer on a later day and maybe get more visual with the different, because now it's like it's different trades mean different things for different teams spending in different ranges. So I want to clarify that a bit more. I'm going to go over that a bit more. So we'll finish off with our last point here today, and then last point, salary cap exceptions that used to begin prorating downward on January 10th will now begin prorating on the day after the trade deadline. So interesting, those like injury exceptions and whatnot, their expiry date has been moved to the day after trade deadline. Interesting. So another little change in how the exceptions work and whatnot. So all this stuff is really like the mechanisms after that first salary number, where it's not actual free space, where the Rockets had actual free space, and that's why they could just outright sign Van Vliet, versus where other teams would have had to sign and trade based on not having that free money to spend. And so there are more exceptions for like teams before that first apron, and a little bit in that first apron, but not in the second apron, and they're limiting the shutting down that part. So next week we'll go on to the contracts and some of the miscellaneous changes that are left, and finish off the CBA changes for this year, and we'll continue on with our other stuff we have planned for this summer. Housekeeping. I always want to start off by saluting the real ones, thanking them for the comments, the likes, the subs, the feedback. You know, it helps me shape what's going on over here at Logical Raptors Fanatic. And I always want to shout out Raptors Freak Nation and Raptors Freak Lex, 9:30 a.m. Eastern, every day talking the Raps. Going through Summer League right now, covering the games. If you didn't catch them, maybe you get a good recap of all the different little bits of information and whatnot. Grubstown Clink's another great channel that has a lot of great videos that might open your mind to thinking about things in a couple different ways, and it's a great broadening of horizons. And then we also have Van Hoot's Basketball Rewind, with great conversation on current Raptors topics, a lot of great info. All three are great creators. Love to be like being a creator with them and whatnot. So I'll leave it off there. Salute the real ones. Project Truth always. Logical Raptors Fanatic out. Mike G.
Oh man, I love my team. Man, I love my team. I would die for them.
Not just cause I want to, cause I got to. Put the squad on your back, did the impossible. It's only logical, spit it from the heart.
Problems hit the gym, they all work out. MVP. Even next season looking like a breeze.